Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 9, which is the second episode in our two-part series on England in the Anglo-Saxon era. As always, I'm going to start us off with a bit of a tune to give people a chance to get to the stream and all the rest of it.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild. Your new gods sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love and heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
That was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do please go and check out his YouTube channel. Now, before we start this evening, let me just say, obviously, happy St. George's Day to all good English men and English women around the world. I'm a big supporter of St. George's Day, and hopefully this stream about Anglo-Saxon England will be a suitable way to celebrate it. Good evening to my guests, Mitch and AI. How are you going this evening, gentlemen?
All right.
Yeah, happy St. George's Day, everybody.
Absolutely.
Happy Turkish Barber's Day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I pointed out on my Twitter, my X post, he was actually a Greek-speaking Christian Roman soldier.
And I was going to say Jesus was actually an Anglo-Saxon soldier, and actually St. George was his dad was born in Staffordshire. Like my great granddad claims to have known St. George as a young nipper.
Yeah, I get you, mate. I get you. But yeah, no, he was actually pretty well known in Anglo-Saxon England. The church knew about him, and he was first used as the name St. George was first used as a war cry by English soldiers under Richard the Lionheart in the Third Crusade in the 1100s. So he's not hardly a new addition to England.
I believe
Yes.
Harold. I believe Harold I believe Harold Godwin used who's the Saxon Anglo-Saxon soldiers called upon the blessings of St. George.
Could well be.
I remember.
As I said, he was definitely known in Anglo-Saxon England. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's worth noting that the patron saint of England was Edmund the Martyr, who I imagine will be mentioned later in reference to the Norse invasions.
Well, I think that's a good segue, Mitch, because if you want to know the early history of Anglo-Saxon England, then watch our stream last week, which Mitch and I were also kind enough to join into. So go and watch that if you want to know about the early post-Roman Anglo-Saxon settlement of England. And today we're going to talk about more the high Anglo-Saxon culture of Anglo-Saxon England. And I think talking about St. George, who obviously is a Christian saint, is a good segue into, I think Mitch wants to talk a bit about the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. So take it away, Mitch.
Yeah, so in the latter end of the 6th century, King Ethelbert of Kent, he marries Bertha, I believe her name was, of the Merovingian dynasty of what up to the time being was called the West Francia, I believe. Well, we just everyone called it Frankland at the time, but basically France before it became the France we all think of today. So the Merovingian dynasty, of course, they spoke Old Frankish at this time. There was a lot of cultural influence from the now long since Christianized Frankish, who have been Christian since Clovis. And as a result of his marriage, King Ethelbert, he starts to get into Christianity. Of course, as a pagan, he can be somewhat. But there was a concept that this was mainly more a Viking thing, but Anglo-Saxons also did it, where they'd hedge their bets. So they would get into Christianity, but not go so far as to forsake their original pagan ideas altogether. So you'd have someone like Ethelbert. He would often use Christianity as a sort of casus belli on all of his neighbours. So, for example, he would invade Wessex with an army, so in the name of Christianity, but it just happens to act as a good enough justification for his conquest. So there was an element of it being geopolitically convenient for King Ethelbert, but also there was a great deal of, well, it was going to happen at some point because just across the channel, one of the most powerful hegemons of Western Europe happened to be a Christian power, and their royal family was married into a royal family over here.
Mitch, I was watching the Tom Rouse stream that was on last week about the Anglo-Saxons. I think you watched it as well. The Survive the Jive stream, and he was saying that the dude who was buried at Sutton Hoo, who was an Anglo-Saxon king, he at one stage converted to Christianity, but only partly, and then later on. He was told later on, no, you can't do that. You can't, because obviously the pagan Anglo-Saxons they had many gods. But he thought, okay, I can just add the Christian God to this pantheon. And then eventually he realized, no, you're not allowed to do that. And so he went back to paganism, apparently. Have you heard about that?
It's quite funny, Andrew, you mentioned that, because that happens a lot. This happened with the Anglo-Saxons. It happened with the Russians, the East Slavs. It was very common with the Slavs. I mean, the most notable one that I can think of in sort of more later times was with the Mexican tribes under Cortez. You know, there was like, oh, just add Jesus to our pantheon of gods and all that. It's quite in that transition period when you have people who are pagan mindset who um are who are presented with a sort of monolithic religious system, struggle to adapt to it, and that's one thing you see with the Anglo-Saxons, is that on one hand, I mean, like the Franks and everything, they would know the Christianity. The higher ups in the Anglo-Saxon world, like the kings and the court, they would know about the Franks. They would know about the church. They would know about the systems that they have over there, and the gods, and the god that they worship, even on the baseline. But when it came to enacting it, they still had like this bizarre syncretic sort of tendency. And I think I know some historians now. I know with the King of Kent. Now his wife, so this is Ethelbert. Bertha, she brought over a bishop from Francia. I think his name was it Lund or something like that, or Luhind, or something like that.
I
And
remember one time they had because I've been was at the time when Canterbury was being set up as a church, and that's why Canterbury is, of course, the seat of Christendom in England. And
yeah,
I believe, and there was one point where they had like an Anatolian fellow from the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, for reference, this was like the furthest thing you could possibly like. We often talk about, let's say, let's say we've always been a country of immigrants, and it's like, black people, and blah blah blah. And like, that was the furthest thing they would have to a foreigner, would be an Anatolian Greek coming over to be a bishop in Canterbury at that time, because of schism,
yeah.
of course, it happened.
So still a European, basically.
Well, he would have been white. Yes, he wouldn't have looked
Yes,
Turkish.
exactly.
He wouldn't even have a looked Aramaic, Assyrian at all. He wouldn't have looked anything like. He would have been effectively Anatolian. He would have been look exactly the same as an ethnic Greek. I mean, he may have had a bit of an olive complexion to his skin, but it wouldn't have been out of place and of any of Italian or someone like that. And actually, if you look at Anatolian, the DNA, they share quite similar DNA to what was it, the Balkans, Italians, Phoenicians. There's that similar. I think Survivor Jive has talked about that.
Yeah, and of course, this was long before the modern Turks were anywhere near Turkey. They were still in Central Asia at this time.
Oh, about 500 years. I mean, the modern Turks didn't like. I think it was the 12th century that they actually broke into Anatolia properly and started, having tribes settling in the higher plateau region, and then slowly chipped away at, Byzantine authority in that area. And unfortunately, a lot of Turks and Greeks won't want to hear this, but most people in Turkey today are actually probably more ethnically Greek than they are Turkish. But there we go.
Yeah, especially in the west of the country. Yes, that was like the Aegean coastline. I imagine the centre of me is got massively depopulated, so that's why.
Well, I mean,
of course,
even if you go back to the massive Persian invasion of Greece, that led to the Battle of Thermopylae and all the rest of it that everyone knows about. At that time, even the Anatolian coast was more Greek than anything else. There were lots of Greek cities there, and it was there rebellion which Athens supported that really led to the Turkish invasion of Greece.
Yeah.
Sorry, not the Persian invasion of Greece, I beg your pardon. But,
and it also helped Alexander when he then invaded the Achaemenids.
And went the other way, yes.
Yeah, the other way. Yeah, because he never really fought a battle in Western Anatolia. He would march into cities unopposed, just march in, and they'd welcome him as a hero, and that'd be it. The satraps,
because they were Greek cities. Yeah, absolutely.
They were Greek. Yeah. Sorry. Go back to the Anglo-Saxon stuff. My point with there is when Bertha brought over a bishop, he did set up like a small unofficial missionary thing where he would convert maybe a few people in villages, but there was no like major breakthrough. And also in the court he would convert a few to Christianity, but he didn't convert at that point the king Ethelbert, or even really attempt to. And Ethelbert himself was like, well, he wasn't going to enforce, he wasn't going to stop the Christianization, but he wasn't going to enforce it either way. And we don't really see it until the Gregorian mission, which is the one where it was led by Saint Augustine, not Saint Augustine of Hippo, but this is a different one. Obviously, there's a couple hundred years difference with these two, but this was Saint Augustine of Canterbury, who I guess I think he is known as the Apostle to the English. That is his title. He is the Apostle to the English.
Yeah, 'cause,
And
I was just going to say, so I believe there's a story around this time where when, let's say, a group of Englishmen who were in Rome, and Pope Gregorius, I believe it was, he remarked that the Englishmen are so handsome that we must convert them to Christianity, hence why the Augustine mission took place.
yeah, he saw a group of English. I mean, this is quite funny. Is even at this time in Rome, you would have Lombards, you would have Franks, you would have Anglo-Saxons, because they wouldn't have been Christian. They probably I mean, why they may have been traders, or maybe even mercenaries for hire, who knows? But you had them coming into Rome, and and other Norse people just popping up, travelers coming in into southern Europe at this point. And the decision was made for a mission to set up, and when he arrived, I think there was about 40 monks who accompanied Saint Augustine on the Gregorian mission. And according to letters sent, because they landed at Thanet in Kent, so this was the point where they land. Now, according to Saint Augustine, when he sent letters to the Patriarch of Alexandria, he said that it was a huge success. He said that he arrived, he converted many sort of villages and settlements, many people in court, even like vassals of the king, and certain warriors and stuff. But he didn't actually mention converting the king, and that probably because the king converted a bit slightly later. And as soon I think there's a bit of debate when where the king was converted. The more I think Mark Morris puts at 601 as the latest date of conversion, which I agree. I think it probably was around that time, because that's when you start seeing heathen idols being forcefully done away with in the kingdom, and starting to be prohibited by the king, which sort of indicates that this was the point of where he was enforcing Christian doctrine. And bearing in mind at this point, still the vast majority of his subjects would be pagan, and they'd be pagan after his death. As we see in most missions, the Christian missionaries would enter the court of the ruling family, and they would start at the top, and the idea is it would filter its way down. And on the back of this mission, you had the places like Essex. The monks would go off to the neighbouring smaller kingdoms of Essex and Sussex, even into Wessex. And at the same time, you had the other missionaries from Ireland who were going about crossing the border with the Scots and the Picts and stuff into the kingdoms of Bernicia and Deria, which then at this point was being united under the same crown, like a crown of unions, as Northumbria, and they were flooding around. They were sort of spreading Christianity in Northumbria, but it was Celtic. It was a form of sort of Irish Christianity. And Mercia in between. You had Lindsay. You had Mercia in between, who would get sort of the bit of both. And one of the problems was that would come about is you would have, as you mentioned, we mentioned earlier with East Anglia, like the Sutton Hoo, the king who was buried there, whose name I forget now, but you would have this occasion where they would convert to Christianity and then revert back to paganism, and this happened a couple times in Northumbria. And of course, then in Mercia, you had the likes of King Penda, who was vehemently anti-Christian. He was a staunch pagan, and my read on this is that a lot of the hatred of Christianity from a lot of the pagans was directed at the Irish interpretations and spreading of Christianity. And I believe it was purely on an ethnic line. If I was to look at it, and the reason why is this one very important example where you have this is going into the following century. In the 8th century, you had towards the end of the 7th century, early 8th century, you had Saint Wilfrid, who was a very important Anglo-Saxon figure for Christianity, and one that Bede refers to a few times, who was brought up with the Roman style of Christianity and educated. And he spent most of his time in the city of Lyon in the Frankish realm, and also Rome.
So far as I understand it, the differences between these forms of Christianity were not actually all that enormous.
No. The only difference that I would say is that one group was basically led by Irish, maybe Welsh, but Irish monks.
Yeah.
And the other would have been Franks, fellow Germanic peoples.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I understand that.
And Gallic Romans.
Yeah. What date would you guys say that most Anglo-Saxons were converted by?
So
if you want to talk about when the kingdoms were quite solidified in Christianity, I would say the start of the 8th century. I would say about 700 AD. If you talk about the most Anglo-Saxon people, I would say maybe 760, 770 AD.
You agree with that one, Mitch?
So, King Penda was the last serious threat to any sort of Christianization, and he was killed off in 655. So, from 655 onward, I would say it was dead certain that we were going to be Christian. There was no chance of a reversion to paganism from that point. However, in 700, there are records where it was said that pagan parents of children who were baptized without the parents' knowledge, the parents would often kill their baptized children. So there was a lot more. There was a sense of it was still quite polarized thing even in 700 AD. So you can imagine, certainly by the time the Vikings show up in 793 at Lindisfarne, by that time we are decidedly a very Christian population, whereas at the
Yeah.
start of the country, it's
Yeah, no,
still quite polarized.
that strikes me as pretty realistic, guys. Black-pilled Pigeon in the chat says Saint Augustine was the guy who said it was easy to confuse the blonde hair of Anglo-Saxon slaves for angels. Always thought that quote pederastic. I think it's more classical, to be honest with you, because if you look at classical history, which the early Christian church adopted a great deal from. There was human beauty as opposed to just female beauty was a thing, and I think that the early Christian church adopted quite a lot of that sort of classical stuff. I don't necessarily think it was pederastic, but
So just to answer Duke Valentino, basically by the time the Vikings come along with pretty much Christian society, and I forget which book I read. It wasn't Mark Moses' book. It was another book I read about the Vikings. It basically when the Vikings had shown up, it felt like the Anglo-Saxon confronting their past in a way, because of course the Vikings were basically just the same as the Anglo-Saxons, just like 200 years before.
Very, very similar. Very, very similar. The weapons, the armor, the shields, all that stuff was almost identical, to be honest. And of course, as we mentioned last week, even by King Alfred the Great's time, which is the later 800s, Alfred the Great, although he was absolutely a Christian king and quite pious, apparently, he claimed descent from Odin. So
I mean, just to quickly reference our previous stream, one thing that is really interesting is if you look at the founders of Wessex, of Sussex, of Kent, of East Anglia, there's this one common Germanic sort of narrative, and you see, I think it's in Beowulf, the Geats have this, a lot of Germanic groups have this, effectively that the story is of three ships, two brothers, or two
Hengist
figures.
and Horsa.
Yeah, Hengist and Horsa. Was it Cernu and Cernic and in Wessex? There's this very common trait of particularly the three ships as well, which is I think there's a reference in the Icelandic sagas as well to that. Is a very, very common story of a foundation, and they claim descendant from Thor. I think the House of Wessex also said that they're also the offspring of Hengist and Horsa, who's the descendants of Thor, and so there's that that particular story, I believe, is mainly written down by Bede, who was, of course, a Christian monk, which is quite interesting. This is the interesting thing, because this sort of story, the Hengist and Horsa bit, and a lot of it comes from Bede. But the thing,
we have very, very few sources from this era. This is one of the things. It's partly why it is called the Dark Ages. It's because we don't have many sources from it. So
and it's one of those things where it's so very interesting because it's a matter of your imagination has a lot of sway on this. It's dependent on your perspective. So that's one reason why this era is probably my favourite to study.
Yeah, it's wrapped in mystery. I mean, effectively, you got two sources. You got Bede, who talks about these heroic sagas, and then you got Gildas, who's like bitching and moaning to the Roman British authorities about the state of the country. So that's your two sources. So go figure. Go sort of decode it from there.
And that's one thing to note. So 4 years after Lindisfarne, for example, Alcuin, who was one of Charlemagne's advisors, he was bemoaning that the Anglo-Saxons still stuck to reading old tales of Beowulf and Ingolf. Because it's worth noting that Beowulf, they read it, like, so the fact that he was written to begin with, generally tells you, okay, it was of course done after we converted. However, the memory of paganism was still alive, because J.R. Tolkien mentions this in his sort of in his commentary about it, that it was written by a Christian, but that Christian still had a lot of pagan influence. Like, a lot of pagan themes are still preserved. So even though we had converted to Christianity, it took more than a few generations for the old stories like Beowulf and even still, Beowulf was still widely read among the Anglo-Saxons, because of course we're a warrior people. It's like Clovis, the story of Clovis, where when he heard about Jesus, when he was told by a priest about how Jesus died, he said, "If I was there with my warriors, Jesus would not be dead." Basically, so it's pretty much what the Anglo-Saxons were like back then. Was they were warrior people. They didn't want to read the Bible all the time. They still cling on, and even like English monks would just read Beowulf, and some ecclesiastical authorities back in Rome would complain about it. But
yeah, absolutely. Black pigeon pilled in the chat here. The British Isles could hardly be penal colonies mining tin when you only really find tin in Cornwall. You know, you wouldn't get much joy trying to mine tin anywhere else in the country, to be quite honest. So,
and to Duke Valentine, basically the Anglo-Saxons are, they're a lot more of a civilized like we're a lot more civilized and patriarchal, and also we don't have the so the Vikings, who are pagan, they have all the shield maidens in their legends, whereas by that time we don't. All our Anglo-Saxon women at that time, for example, were they were mothers. They weren't really spoken of. And for example, the word queen didn't exist in English at that point. It only you'd have a king, but there was no separate word. It was a woman in a similar role. She was just referred to as king's consort or words of that nature. Like queen didn't enter until much later on. But I think it was the Emma of Normandy, I believe, was the first woman to be referred to as queen.
I'm trying to get what Duke Valentino means by why are Anglo-Saxon people depicted as weak and cowardly? Because they're not.
I know. I
presume if you're talking about helpless monks, then possibly so. But the only people who ever fought the Vikings and the Norse off were the English. So, making them out to be weak and cowardly is not going to go very far,
I think what Duke Valentino is getting at is that in the media, like if you look at the existing films and modern films and TV shows of like the Vikings against the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings are depicted as like these wearing these ridiculous fantasy leather jackets, leather armor, and they're basically cutting through like shield walls of Anglo-Saxons. And I think the reason why it's depicted is just anti-white English hatred. There is this within the intelligentsia. There has been this push about we're not so unique. We're a nation of immigrants and everything that gets pushed on there. That's why I don't like the Bernard Cornwell novel too much about the Last Kingdom. There's quite a lot of I've read a bit of that. There's a lot of subversion in that. I don't like it. And also, thirdly, it's not true. The reason why the Vikings had a particular edge on a lot of the Anglo-Saxons was because a lot of it was surprise attacks, but also they were better at getting on mobility when it came to crisscrossing the country on their ships. They were fast enough to get into certain locations, to raid, to get out.
Which, as you said, AI is basically surprise attacks. I mean, most of this Viking stuff was raids, and it was surprise attacks. And all right, we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about the Viking raids, which started at Lindisfarne. But no one would expect a group of helpless Christian monks to be put up much of a defense against the Vikings.
No,
It became very different when they actually started attacking the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which we're also going to talk about.
Well, yeah, because when Alfred started building, as we get this is a lot later on, but on that final point, I mean, a good example is when Alfred started building fortifications. You know, these what are they like? These boroughs, these small fortifications, that did stop any future from the Danelaw, particularly any Viking raiders crossing into the Wessex
hang
Park.
on, AI. I'm conscious that this is jumping ahead a bit, and I do want to
Yeah.
talk about this stuff, but and other things related to that. But I'd like to try and get us back to the original Seven Kingdoms era. And before we do that, I just want to say to Dominus Diabolus in the chat, no, the Anglo-Saxons have not been subjugated by the Normans for almost 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxons actually absorbed the Normans to a large degree. And
Well,
there
the
were
Norman
never
house,
very many of them.
the Norman house was driven out by the House of Avignon. They that as of the Plantagenets. They went extinct.
Pretty much.
It was what was it? It was Godfrey of Anjou, and because he married, was it Adelaide of Anjou? Sorry, not Angevin. Sorry, Anjou. That's what I was meant to say.
Yeah.
Anjou. It was the after the reign of King Stephen. Yeah.
Absolutely. But anyway, let us get back to the Seven Kingdoms, if we may, AI and Mitch.
So
would you guys like to go on about that?
Yeah, so say if we were over Humber, Mercia, which is my neck of the woods, the Midlands, Mercia dominated for a long time. I mean, apex of this was the King Offa, who ruled at pretty much the same time as Charlemagne on the continent. And Offa and Charlemagne got on so well personally, but Charlemagne had only referred to one person ever as his equal, and that was King Offa of Mercia. Now, of course, the problem with Mercia was every time a king died, all the males in the family would squabble over the throne. So Offa often had to kill off half of his own male relatives in order to make sure his children were in a position to inherit the throne. But after Offa died, well, all his children just fight over the inheritance. So that in 825, Egbert, who is the grandfather of Alfred the Great, Egbert defeats the Mercians at the Battle of Ellendun, and this starts off what we call this ends the Mercian hegemony and starts the rise of Wessex. And later on, this is how Wessex came to unify England as opposed to Mercia, because Northumbria at this time, I believe between the dates of 793 through to the start of the Norse invasions, Northumbria went through so many kings inside of 100 years. Northumbria was also chaotic. Wessex, however, they grew to dominate because when Egbert passes away of natural causes, he dominates the south. Even for a time, he's called Brett Walder, where he rules over all of England at this point. But it doesn't last long. However, the main silver lining was when he passed it over to his son Athelwulf, no civil war happened. Like the succession was smooth. This is why Wessex later grew on to dominate over the others in time, because the West Saxon had a lot more stability in their successions. And
I've just put a map up on the screen. It's a later map, but it shows the main four kingdoms.
Yeah, so you have Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria are the main ones that we think of. East Anglia, there was a time when they were dominant for a short while under King Radwald, who was, of course, the god of Sutton Hoo helmet, as we all know.
It was Radwald, wasn't it? Thank you, Mitch. I was trying to remember who that was.
Yeah, Radwald, yeah.
Yeah. Beyond him, however, East Anglia was largely dominated by Mercia, and then later on dominated by Wessex, before, of course, the Norse invasions happened. As for Kent, technically it wasn't annexed by Wessex, but they were pushing puppets of Wessex on the Egbert onward. So by this time, so certainly mid-9th century, yeah, the south of England is dominated by Wessex. Cornwall and Devon technically are not like they have to pay tribute, and they acknowledge West Saxon dominance, but they're not ruled over by the Anglo-Saxons as of yet. So Devon and Cornwall are still very Brythonic territory.
Yeah,
I mean,
the
Devon.
Picts, Duke Valentino is asking about the Picts. The Picts in Scotland were mainly taken over by the Scots, who in fact were Irish. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah,
I
was
think
going to say
with
I was just going to say with Devon, I believe it was down to one of the Wessex Egberts that actually captured. I mean, if you look at the map below, it sort of gives a bit of a thing. What's now considered like north and eastern Devon fell within the boundaries of the Anglo-Saxon realm, but western portion, like Torridge, western portions of Devon, South Devon, and Cornwall did remain, Brythonic. But
But they were tributary to the Wessex kings.
But Exeter, for example, Exeter was Anglo-Saxon. It was an Anglo-Saxon, sort of city, I guess you could say. And if you go to somewhere like, part of East Devon, you even have like a few there's an old in one of the villages there. There's like an Anglo-Saxon like excavation of an Anglo-Saxon village, and the reason they know it's Anglo-Saxon, of course, it's bodies of DNA, but also the types of art and craft and things like that that can just be easily identify. So in Devon at the time of Alfred, or just after Alfred, you already had that expansion, and yeah, I mean, again, where I would have been in Devon, when I crossed from the in North Devon along the coastline, there's I mentioned this a few times. I've come across like there's been like an Anglo-Saxon chapel, an old Anglo-Saxon fort, for example. So the fort itself was designed purely to keep watch over the channel to for Viking raids.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, people in the chat are asking, was Scotland sparsely populated? Yes, relatively speaking. So was quite a lot of Wales, and so was parts of Devon and Cornwall. Even if you go there today, and I'm sure I said this last week, if you go to Scotland today, or parts of Wales and bits of Devon and Cornwall, it's not very good agricultural land. Quite often you'll find the main agriculture there is like sheep farming on hills, because that's the main thing you can keep there, basically.
Yeah, last time I went to Scotland, I went, so if you look at central Scotland where you have Perth, I mean, that's like beyond Perth, you have the gateway to the Highlands. From Perth to Inverness, right up in the north, there's nothing. I think there was like one village and a dam, and that's about it. There was nothing there, and all the land was just very rugged, rugged land, no farming.
It's not good for growing crops and all that sort of stuff. So the most populated area was and is the southeast and the Midlands. It's always been that way in England. It's just the way the land is.
Yeah, just to answer Duke Valentino was the most populous kingdom. In reference to England, that'll be Mercia, because you have rivers like the Severn, the Trent, and I'm trying to think of other. But yeah, you had damn good agricultural land in the Midlands. However, as it said, like the land tore itself to pieces because every time a king died, the succession would always be in doubt. And also, as an iron law of countries, yeah, you have Mercia, which is sandwiched in between the north and the south. So if you have like a powerful north, like basically when you have the Danelaw coming to being, the Mercians are squashed, and of course they get their back broken later on, so they just get absorbed by Wessex later on.
Yeah.
Because like,
Yeah, no, all perfectly true. But I mean, Kent's called the Garden of England for a reason, because it's got very good farmland where you can grow crops and you can have orchards and all sorts of other things. You can't really do that in a lot of other parts of England. And as Mitch said, the Midlands has excellent farming land, always has had.
Yeah, like you have
and the home.
And the home counties, yeah.
Yeah, and the home counties, Hampshire, across. I mean, this was, I mean, remember the sort of, as much as Somerset is mythologized in like the story of Wessex and everything, it really wasn't. It wasn't really worth much compared to, say, Wiltshire, Hampshire, that those sorts of counties, earldoms, whatever you want to call it, because of the farmland. Because that was, as we talked about last time, the main value in that time period in the world, but especially in Anglo-Saxon England, was land, farming, agriculture. That was what was determined who had power and at the time.
And you also needed to be able to raise cattle on it as well, and cattle can't do very well on like scrubby hillsides. Sheep will,
or bogs or
cows,
swamp.
Yeah, cows don't do very well in that sort of area,
No, it's or bogs and swamps and stuff like that.
Yeah, because it's worth noting, like you have East Anglia, for example. Yeah, but you still have the fens still quite apt. I mean, you have I believe it's Somerset, isn't it, where you have Athelney marshes, which you'll get mentioned later. But this is so you can imagine plenty of land that was still quite a bit swampy and not suitable for settlement at that point. It was only it's like because one thing you notice in English language a bit. I'm going off a bit, but basically you notice a lot of words to do with drainage come from Dutch, because basically from the 1500s onward we import loads of Dutch people to help us reclaim the land from the marshes and so on. So that's one thing you got to bear in mind with a lot of it. Like you have some land which nowadays is agriculturally productive, but back then wasn't.
Yeah, I mean the first proper drainage, first proper like drainage or attempt to drain, I think, was by the Normans in the fens.
Yeah, now they had to do that because we had Hereward the Wake, and like he in his band about. So it was because that area of England has always been, until the fens were properly dealt with, it was always a good vector for guerrilla warfare. So that's one thing. So that's because technically, if we say the Seven Kingdoms, now technically it was an eighth, but it wasn't really kingdom, or it didn't really last long. It was Huicia, I believe it's called, or Huicia, however you pronounce it, around Gloucestershire way. But they got absorbed by the West Saxons pretty early on, so technically they're not included.
Yeah, it was. I mean, Offa was the one who first started like the overlordship, right? I believe. I'm trying to find out because I want to know what's happened. Because also you had like you had the middle Angles as well, which were just totally not. There's hardly anything about that. It just looks like they were conquered by the Mercians. They were obviously within like Nottinghamshire region. They were just conquered by the Mercians, right? Heg was between Wessex and Mercia. They were carved up between the Mercia and Wessex. And also one kingdom we haven't mentioned, which wasn't a Saxon kingdom but was a sort of Celtic one, was and I'm going to I believe it's called Reged, which is I'm probably mispronouncing that terribly. Up north,
Reggae, or something like that.
Yeah. Now, if you look at the map here, it's basically the entire western area of Northumbria. So you're talking about Lancashire and Burness and Bury-in-Furness, around that area, and Cumbria, mainly just Cumbria. The centre was Cumbria, and at some point in the 7th century, after the unification of Northumbria as a united sort of kingdom, they managed to overrun the Cumbrians. Now, at the time of Bede, it does seem that the sort of Cumbrian language, there is a distinct Cumbrian culture language separate of that of the Saxon, of the Angle.
Yeah, I've heard it was still spoken around the time of 1066. It would only disappeared, however, by like 1200, I believe, at the latest. So it's so, and I believe like if when Scotland makes a unifies as well, that Cumbria often switches between England, Scotland, until the Normans come in and like I think it's either William the Conqueror, or one of his sons, who basically took Cumbria off of Scottish, and that's why Cumbria's been part of England ever since.
Yes, yeah, and
Duke
just to and
Valentino is asking, was all the tin and copper extracted by the Romans? No, it
no,
wasn't. There were
no.
still tin mines in Cornwall in the 19th and early 20th century. So no,
I
absolutely not.
remember living when I was living in Cornwall when the tin mines were still going.
Yep, exactly.
Even
There's still
yeah,
tin in Cornwall to this day, if it was economic enough to get it out.
and just Baron Badger. Yeah, I wasn't referring to Middlesex, but Middlesex is in that region. The Middle Angles are in they're basically in sort of bang in the west, just east of the Derbyshire region. This sort of, I mean, as we talked about last week, that you had these smaller tribes that had small tribal states, and then it formed into kingdoms. They would have been the ones unfortunate to have been just absorbed by the larger Mercians. Like also Lindsay. I mean, the little between York and Mercia uh, I'd say just east of or just south of York actually was again absorbed by Mercia, because that's just how it happened, you know.
Yep, absolutely. All right, guys, I think we've been going for almost an hour, so I think we should move on to the period that my map illustrates, which is the four main kingdoms and the rise of Wessex as the premier kingdom, shall we say. Could we perhaps move on to that now for our second hour?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I'm guessing, because we're going to go on to we're going on to quickly onto the Viking Age.
Well, the
The
Viking invasions, but yes,
the
yes.
Viking Age. Well, see, the Viking Age historically, from the 19th century, particularly, that is very much viewed that the raid on Lindisfarne in the realm of Northumbria, just the island monastery just off the coast of Bamborough, in Northumbria, was the start of the Viking Age, because that was when the Vikings pretty much, it was the first major raid. I believe there had been other Norse raids. There'd been raids in Scotland. They'd already set up shop in Ireland and Dublin, because of course Dublin was founded by a Viking clan who settled there. But this is considered like the first major raid in Northumbria, mainly because at this particular point there wasn't really I mean, yeah, there's someone just Duke Valentino said, "What is this the first confirmed one?" Um, oh, sorry, I thought that maybe I'm thinking of the Western Isles. Maybe I'm getting a bit mixed up of which one came first. But yeah, this was the first major raid on the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and particularly targeting the church, because this was a monastery. There was no defenses at all. I believe, those that weren't monks that weren't killed in the raid were carted off as slaves, and it was completely sacked. The monastery was completely sacked, and this was the catalyst, because then, of course, word spread back to the Norse, that you know you have the Anglo-Saxon lands, you have these properties, these monasteries, which were left completely undefended and had these riches of gold and jewelry and finery, that they could plunder and raid on, and this is sort of what triggered it.
Yeah, just to answer, do you want to do use when this one monastery? Yeah, it still did. Like even like 4 years after, there was like Alcuin, as mentioned earlier, advisor to Charlemagne. He was writing to like a monk in charge of Lindisfarne, bemoaning about how Englishmen were still reading Beowulf and Ingold as opposed to reading the Bible. So even like 4 years after the original raid, they still just rebuilt the monastery and just continued there. It didn't stop. What complicated things, however, was so I believe like I don't like perhaps I'm jumping ahead, but I'm pretty sure like northeastern England, like where basically like Morgoth's neck of the woods, technically wasn't annexed by the Vikings. It was still like it was basically puppeted rulers who had to pay tribute to the Viking Danelaw later on. So
Yeah,
Lindisfarne still functioned
yeah.
even
So
amidst
so
Viking
from
presence.
Fife region, um, Berwick upon Tweed, and down to the River Humber, that was nominally a puppet realm. It was a Northumbrian puppet realm of the Danelaw, and then anything south of that, so like York, Scarborough, what is like Scarborough there, and a place like Redcar, for example, and the bulk of Northumbria was under the control of the Danelaw, the Viking possession, direct direct control, right? And that I was going to say, I'm just bringing up my notes here. So if you two want, because I was just we're going to be because we're talking about the raids, but I want to get I don't want to confuse the raids to the actual Viking invasions itself.
Yeah, they were different. This is one of the things. There was a difference between relatively small Viking raids, and remember, the Vikings were not a people. You went Viking, which was raiding, basically. That's what Viking meant.
Right. Well, to be fair, Viking is a byword for the Norse, as we know them. So words
Yeah,
can change.
it is, but in actual fact, you went Viking.
Okay, and the word
It meant
English,
you
and the
went
word
raiding, basically.
okay, and the word English originally comes from the word angling, like the fishing techniques. So it's like certain activities can become like a byword for
Oh
identity. So
yeah, yeah. No, no, Mitch. I'm not suggesting you're wrong for a minute, mate. All I'm trying to say is that people talk about the Vikings as if they were a people, and you're right. It's used as a simile for a people, but in fact, it was the Danes or the Norse or whatever the hell you want to call them.
yeah, because the word thing about the word Viking was in English we have the same word, but it was pronounced witching because the word witch. So you think of a witch part of like Ipswich or and other areas or a sandwich, which can either mean bay or trading port. So so it means pirate, but like the whole thing is you said it from a bay because of course you got I can't remember what it's called. But it was like a bay. It was like southern Norway, northern Denmark, and southwestern Sweden. That
Yeah,
you had to sail across this particular bay. I can't remember. I can't pronounce it. Like Skagerrak or something like that. That's where
Skagerrak.
a lot of
Yeah,
Vikings came from.
Skagerrak.
All right,
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
I've got
yeah.
the notes up. I got the notes up here. So the actual Viking invasions was led by the five. Effectively, it was five five kings who were the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok.
Hang on a second, AI. Before we go on to the Viking invasions,
Yeah.
can we just talk briefly about the rise of Wessex as the premier kingdom?
Yes.
And then we can go on to the Viking invasions.
The trouble is that's a bit disjointed because the rise of Wessex is as a result of the Viking invasions.
Okay, but let's concentrate because we're talking about Anglo-Saxon England for the most part.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's concentrate on how this led to the rise of Wessex as the most important kingdom, and indeed, as it was for a while, the last kingdom in England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's all. I'm just trying to give our talk here a bit of a shape.
I was just going to say, like, because I think I pretty much went through it earlier about Egbert. I'll let AI talk about Egbert onward.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, as you know, looking at the map there, if you look at the River Humber, or the Thames, or in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, they were on the frontier. The fact that if you look at the North Sea, they were naturally going to be the first point of entry by any Norse raiders or Norse invasions. Wessex didn't really have that problem as such because they had the buffer of Kent, but also they had the Channel. Now later on, of course, the Vikings with the foothold in England, they would then raid up the Bristol Channel, English Channel. They would raid Isle of Wight and everything else. But at this time, I think Wessex were able to benefit effectively from its location, in the sense that it had a pretty decent sort of protection from the Norse originally. I also think, and this is one thing that we can talk about, is that Wessex, unlike the other kingdoms, did actually have a half decent early navy. They did have a decent early navy.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that at some point, AI. I mean, you can plausibly argue that the Royal Navy goes back to Alfred when his English warships battled the Danes off the Dorset coast and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Plymouth, I mentioned last week, places like Plymouth and everything. Now, sites of Plymouth and Exeter actually have Roman origin, same as Winchester, Salisbury. And so a lot of these Roman towns and cities in Wessex still had the original Roman walls. And so some of these coastal settlements in Wessex were already naturally, they were naturally designed for sieges, right? In some cases, they had walls, they had a form of protection.
And the Norse weren't very good at sieges because
No.
they arrived in their longships with spears and axes and swords, but probably not a lot heavier than that. People didn't use much in the way of siege engines in the Dark Ages.
The only example that I can think that they laid siege to anything half successfully was the siege of Paris. But again, that was another. It was roughly around this time, the time of Alfred. But that's the only occasion. But I call it a siege.
But to go back to your point, AI, part of the reason they could do that to Paris was the River Seine.
Yeah, the River Seine, exactly. Because as soon as they entered the Seine, and you basically it's not like the Franks, they had any chains. But the funny thing is, when they did sail down the Rhine and the Seine, the counts in the lower countries actually started building these great chains across to stop them, because they
block the rivers. Yeah. And the English did that too, as I believe we mentioned last week.
Yeah, they ended up having to do that, and it was successful for the most part. It sort of halted them. But yeah, I mean, if you there's actually this one great story of at the time when Alfred was hiding in Somerset, you had the council, the alderman of Devon, I think it was Odo, and he was coming toe to toe with the Anglo-Saxon uh, chief king. Sorry, not chief king. One of the chieftains slash small kings. Uber. Somewhere off the coast of northern Devon or northern Somerset. We don't really know where it happened. The thing is, they reckon it's somewhere around Minehead, for example. So this very coastal region of North Somerset region. And what he was able to do was when they were landing on the coast around Minehead, he positioned spearmen and archers on the cliff and basically just rained down upon them. And they would, because of if you look at pictures, it's basically just the beaches are inaccessible for miles, and there's like these old, small paths, but the beaches are completely exposed to the cliff, and there's lots of easy vantage points to look down and have clear view. And they were constantly hassled on any beaches they couldn't land, and they ended up being chased. He managed to he even killed the king, Uber, by
Yeah,
in that battle.
absolutely, but in order to try and give our stream a bit of shape here, we've got to the stage of the first Viking raids on Lindisfarne and what have you. We've got to the stage of the 7 kingdoms morphing into 4 main kingdoms.
Yeah.
What I'd like us to talk about a bit, and I'll be quite honest, I don't know enough about this to do it on my own, is how Wessex became the main kingdom, leading up to, of course, the great King Alfred the Great, the only English king who's known as the Great. And I'd just like us to talk a bit about that for a while, if you guys would be so kind.
Well, I mean, yeah. So you had the Great Heathen Army, who you had the invade. I mean, the Great Heathen Army, started like the big push after Northumbria.
Yeah,
Northumbria was
let's
captured.
Let's just
No,
be
no,
clear
yeah, I know. I know.
Clear to people in the chat. This is
Yeah.
This is a different thing from the early Viking raids.
Yeah.
This is the Vikings trying to settle in England.
Yeah, this is okay. So just to clarify, the Great Heathen Army is made up of Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Norse from from Scotland, parts of Scotland. So this includes their commanders and leaders are Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, Uber, who I just mentioned, Guthrum the Old, who was probably the most important one, and Bagseg. These were the Norse. It was basically like this grand army, of various Norse.
But they weren't
rulers.
raiders. AI. The point I'm trying to make here and get across to our chat is these people were not raiders who were coming to raid somewhere, steal stuff, take some slaves, and piss off back to Norway. These guys wanted to settle.
This was a professional force. They wanted to settle. They did settle in parts of Yorkshire and parts of East Anglia. They did settle, and they were a professional army. They had professional encampments. I mean, there's one famous one noted about the encampment outside Reading, for example. That there were these they were this huge host. Hence it was called by the Anglo-Saxons the Great Heathen Army, because it was this, huge army of levied warriors, but also professional axemen, professional warriors. These would have been. They would have
also. I think we've also got to point out that armies in this era were relatively small. Okay, so an
Yeah,
army
you
of
imagine
say
breaking
5,000 or
armies not being
6,000 men was a very big army in this period.
Yeah, the Great Heathen Army was probably around 10,000 men, give or
Yeah,
take.
yeah.
That was nothing.
Which in later eras or in earlier eras in the ancient world, that wouldn't have been a big army. But in this period, armies were quite small. So, as Mitch correctly says, and AI correctly says, an army of 10,000 men could be called a great army because to get enough men to oppose that would be very difficult.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah,
going to Alfred. Now, when Alfred was still, this is when Alfred was still I guess you could say like a prince, if we could use that term, probably, or a cat. He wasn't king at this point. His brother, Ethelred, was king, and in
yeah,
871, at the Battle of Ashdown, um, Alfred was able to lead a defeat against the Vikings and slaying Bagseg, one of the Viking chiefs, as I mentioned earlier in the process. So this was one of this was quite a good. This is why if you were to say Iron Dukes, you were saying like where does Wessex become notable? I would say at Battle of Ashdown, because that's where you actually had like probably it would have been noticed in Europe, for example, a major victory, because when you have a Viking force defeated, their leader dead, and them in retreat back to the Danelaw, that is that's a significant victory. And
Yes.
this is before he was king. I believe his brother was wounded, and so he couldn't partake in the battle, and so he delegated that down to Alfred to lead the men. So yeah.
And
yeah.
of
Because
course,
Bishop
it's
Asser, like that at this time, Alfred was awarded with the title Secondarius because the thing was, Alfred, his children were too young. So in the event that, so when Alfred dies, this is where Alfred becomes king, as opposed to someone like Athelwold, who's a son of King Alfred.
would have
Like
been too
Alfred was
young.
not expected.
He would have
Yeah,
been too young.
yeah, there was a great taboo at this time towards kings, towards regencies in general. They didn't want to have a regency, especially when there's a catastrophic invasion like this. So instead of it passing from father to son, they go from brother to brother, because Alfred was a fifth born child. He was not expected to inherit at all. In fact, his education was neglected. He didn't know how to read or write until the age of 12. And and for example, while he got to go to Rome with his father Athelwulf, yeah, it was generally like he was groomed to be more of a groomed to be a member of the clergy. But then his three oldest brothers, they die one after the other, and then Athelred takes one. Now Alfred can't go into the church now because there's now got the Great Heathen Army to worry about.
He's got
And
to be
if
he's
Athelred
got to
comes
be a
along,
warrior, Mitch. Yeah, a king has to be a warrior in this
I mean,
era.
the impact on the Battle of Ashdown. So going back to it, but again, the impact of it was that the Great Heathen Army, the main bulk of the Heathen Army, had to winter down, because what happened was 3 months after, in 871, uh, Alfred's brother, the king, died, probably due to the wound. I think he was wounded in battle that led to his death. I can't recall fully how it transpired. I believe he was wounded, and so Alfred was well, then became king, and from 871 to 872, the Great Heathen Army was encamped over winter in London, and they had to withdraw just after in the new year, because of the result of Ashdown. You had rebellions popping up back in Northumbria, back in the Danelaw, um, partly due to the fact that the Vikings were defeated, and this was seen as that they were on the back foot. And so you had, I think, even in parts of occupied Mercia, in like Lindsey and stuff like that, you had Anglo-Saxon rebellions against the Vikings.
Would
Yeah, because I was just going to
sorry,
say,
you
so
go on.
I was just going to mention so Edmund the Martyr, so he was the original saint before Saint George. He was slain by the Vikings in Gruesome Well. He was peppered with arrows by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, of course, this is one thing that massively propels Alfred, because before that, before the Battle of Ashdown, everyone's despairing, everyone thinks the end is nigh for Christianity in England, and that England's going to be ruled over by the pagan Norsemen. And of course, Edmund the Martyr's death was like a very bad omen to that. However, after the Battle of Ashdown, Alfred is now able to take moral authority in terms of, because while technically England didn't exist as a unified entity, there was a sense that this was a merging consciousness that all the Anglo-Saxon peoples had to band together against this common pagan threat. So this is why Ashdown, and especially later on in 878, which I imagine we'll get to, this is how Wessex comes to be not just the last kingdom, but the one kingdom that unifies England. Because yeah, on one hand you had Egbert, as I mentioned earlier, who started Wessex's rise through ensuring a stable succession and so on, and providing political stability. But then Alfred really kicks it into full force through his leadership later on.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, looking at this from someone who is not a historical expert, which I'm certainly not on this era. When I was a kid, I was taught at school about Alfred and the cakes, and Alfred hiding in the marshes and all this kind of stuff. Would you guys like to talk about how that stuff happened?
Yeah,
So
so I'll let Mitch start with how he had to flee I think it was Cirencester, wasn't it, Mitch, into Somerset?
it was a January 878. He was surprise attacked at Chippenham because
Oh, sorry, Chippenham. It was Chippenham. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So there's a surprise attack. I don't know but basically it's a massive surprise attack. Many of Alfred's subjects are slain, and he has to flee into the Athelney marshes. So the kingdom gets overrun, and generally it's a very low point. Now, there are certain stories that pop up about this period, like, for example, as in Alfred with the Cakes. Now, the first time this was written about was 100 years after the fact. But given that it was 100 years after it was started to get written, they genuinely think there's some kind of truth to it, because clearly it must have been a matter of local folklore that endured that, and later it just got so recited that eventually someone wrote it down. So there probably is a kernel of truth to it. Even if it's not true, the fact still remains that, it made Alfred very much of a moral authority in terms of England back then.
The local legend, because of course I currently live in that. I'm actually, if I look out my window now, I can see Athelney just in the well, not now because it's dark, but during the day I can see it. That's how close I am. I can see the hillock and the surrounding hillocks here. But to that point, the legend has always been that the reason why, because he was meant to watch over the cakes, and because he was sort of absorbed in thought and a bit of self-pity and stuff like that, that he allowed it. He ended up not paying attention, and it was burnt. And then he got chastised by, this lady who was who's baking the cakes, and he got chastised for not paying attention and saying, "Look what you've done here," and everything. This has sort of been like the backbone of like this stiff, like English stoic nature. That, listen, pick yourself up. You need to focus on what you need to do and everything. Now, obviously, it probably, historically speaking, it didn't happen, but it does actually ring. Asa does talk about that there was this feeling of a bit of a hopelessness. But the thing there was that when Alfred, I mean, in reality, when he did arrive in the marshes, the reason he went to Athelney was that there was a few settlements nearby. He was very close to the alderman of Somerset, who was now still an ally of his. but also you had a forge, a pretty decent forge there. And also it gave him time to regroup, and he was able to, because of the marshes, the Viking longships only had really two entrances. They had the River Parrot and the River Tone, and both of them went through points which were easily scouted, and they would enter the Somerset marshes, and it was really difficult for them to navigate. It was incredibly difficult, in fact. And on one occasion, they would be attacked. The actual the West Saxons would end up doing the sort of surprise attacks on them, and so because they were looking for Alfred and they couldn't find them. And also there was the natural thing. There's this natural phenomenon there where you have this mist that hovers just above the ground, about 2 meters above the ground. And so, especially in the morning, because at this time it's like, what is it? It's January, February, so you're still in winter. It is a complete and utter nightmare to navigate. If you actually see it, you got to see it. I mean, today you have the benefit of it all being drained and its fields and what have you, but it's back then marshes and that complete nightmare to navigate. And in the end, you had the biggest threat that Alfred had was there was a potential coup brewing where because there was uncertainty about his current being, that his vassals like the aldermans of Hampshire and Sussex and stuff, would they remain loyal to him? Now the count, the alderman of Devon, he was presented with this, and as I mentioned earlier, he had his own battle with the Vikings, and he remained loyal, and the same with Somerset. And he was able to get message out there, and he was able to rally his forces and march forth in May, in the spring, start of the summer, and he met Guthrum at the Battle of Edington, who was the Viking pursuing him, and after Chippenham, and he won an extraordinary victory against Guthrum's forces. Guthrum was the self-proclaimed king of East Anglia. He conquered the East Anglians, took the title of king of their ruler, and he ended up meeting Alfred in battle, and Alfred not only defeated them, he chased their army and captured Guthrum and his entire family after the battle. As a result, part of the agreement was that Guthrum was baptized and his family were baptized. I mean, this was, as I mentioned Ashdown before, this compares nothing to Ashdown. This was a huge victory, and this is what broke the Great Heathen Army.
Yeah, AI. Again, I'm going back to my school days when, believe it or not, they used to teach English children this stuff, which I believe they don't anymore, but they certainly used to when I was at school in the late 60s and the 70s. Alfred was sending out messages to get the Thanes, which was the Anglo-Saxon militia, to come from as far away as Kent to come and reinforce him for this great battle that you're describing.
Yeah. And yes, and that's actually a very good. Thanks for reminding me, Andrew. When Alfred was marching with the men of Somerset and the men of Devon, and meeting up with at Edington, he didn't know if his thanes from Hampshire, Wiltshire, and the home counties regions in Kent were going to turn up. It was just a complete, because they could have turned around and said to him, well, no, we'll accept Viking overlordship or what have you, and not turn up. But they did turn up. All of them. Every single one of them turned up. I don't think a single one didn't turn up of his thanes.
This is partly why he's the only king in England who's called the Great. He's the only one, and it's partly because of stuff like this. There he was, hiding out in these marshes effectively and trying to gather his forces, and he's sending messages all over Anglo-Saxon England to try and get troops to go and fight the great heathen army. And as you say, they do actually turn up.
Yeah, they do. And part of the settlement was that afterwards you had, I believe, part of Mercia, Western Mercia, was then given to Wessex. So there was a reboundary of the Danelaw brought up. Guthrum converted to Christianity, which was quite a major step if you want to talk about the
Well, he didn't
Norse.
have a lot of choice there, because he probably would have been executed otherwise. But yeah, okay.
I will preface that when he was baptized in the rivers of, I think it was like Meldon or somewhere like that, there was like an axe to his neck while doing it. It wasn't like free. It wasn't like the modern evangelical, lovey-dovey conversions you see in America or places like that where it's all free will. No, this was done by the point of the the axe. A bit like what Charlemagne did, when with the Saxons as well. Again, another point actually. Alfred did suffer from Crohn's disease. He had these incredible spates of pain. Asa would talk about, he'd be sitting in camp and Asa would have to interject and help him because he would be crying out in pain, and he had to keep it a secret because, of course, back then, if the men and if the Anglo-Saxon people knew that he had this condition where he would suddenly scream out in pain and be basically on the floor, unable to move, in just an absolute pain, it would be seen as punishment from God.
Would be a bit God. Like it would have been a bit like Julius Caesar suffering from
those epileptic fits.
Yeah, it would have been like you had to hide that stuff in those days. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and Asa, I mean, one thing I will say is that Bishop Asa was like, he was a proper, probably one of the most loyal servants. If you wanted to make a story about like a loyal servant to a king, Asa was one of them. It's incredible actually how loyal he was. He must have been really fond of Alfred on a personal level. He was, because again, he was Welsh. He wasn't a man of Wessex. He could have taken off back to Wales after all of this had happened. He could have just gone off to Wales and gone back to his monastery and everything. But he was he was a real one. he was a real one. He was a real one.
Because at this time, the English and the Welsh, it's not like nowadays where we get on. But back then, there was a strong sense of ethnic hatred between the Anglos and the Celts, because they were always seen as a hereditary enemy. It's like, for example, in Welsh, they still call England to this day Lloydia, or the Lost Land. So you can imagine Asa probably as a Welshman. Yeah, he's not too, he probably grew up hating the English, but at the same time, it's like you can imagine he grew to have a strong companionship with Alfred, because it's like a king. I'm going to just like dissect for 5 seconds. King Penda, he would often ally with certain Welsh princes when fighting Christian Anglo-Saxon kings. So there were times of Welsh and even like Anglo-Saxon times working together. It's like, that's generally like how deep a bond it must have been between Asa and Alfred, because it's also the fact that Asa knew some details about Alfred, like knowing the fact that Alfred did not know how to read or write properly until the age of 12, for example. So the fact that Asa was able to, that you can infer a lot about Alfred the Great. And I remember one time there was an article a few years back saying Alfred the Great may not have been that great because we'll go through it having after.
I I tell you what, Mitch, the worst article I saw about a few months ago was from this. I think it was like some it was something pamphlet, some pamphlet institution or something. This online pamphlet, and they said how Alfred the Great was like the first monarch to to demonstrate Judo-Christian values, and
Oh God!
and if I'm absolutely honest, I don't. There's no reference by Asa or anybody else that he actually even met a Jewish person. Because
There weren't any Jewish people in England at that time. I don't think so.
no,
I don't think
it was the
Alfred was
It was the
before.
Normans that brought them over. It was the Normans that brought them over. Sorry, Iron Duke. Yeah, thank you. So after the Battle of Eddington, this basically became the new settlement agreement between Guthrum and um, Alfred. And as you see, Alfred basically gained Western Mercia, so places like Lichfield, the old capital, was in his bit. Leicester and was the Fens and everything was in Guthrum's bit. And I'm just trying to Guthrum's capital. I thought St Albans was his capital. Do you know his capital, Mitch?
I thought it was somewhere in East Anglia. I thought it was like I'm trying to think because I mean Ipswich is the longest lived settlement in England. I know that for sure. So I was thinking somewhere in East Anglia.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, maybe it was. I thought I remember reading somewhere that maybe I didn't. Maybe they didn't have like capitals as we know it. But I thought St Albans was like a capital, like, or it was like where he had like his army was stationed or something like that.
yeah, it's worth noting with the Danelaw. It's like you don't have to have, let's say, one lord down in East Anglia, but up in York, yeah, the Danelaw wasn't as unified as people might originally think. Because once the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok died, there was nothing really unifying the Vikings anymore, other than just defending what they got. And this is why Alfred the Great, as well as his son Edward the Elder, Athelflaed, and then later on Athelstan, they unified. Now, Athelstan had to face a unified Norse army. However, Alfred, especially his latter reign, as well as his children, they had to face a Danelaw that squabbled as much against itself as they did against the Anglo-Saxons as time passed. So you'd have, let's say, Guthrum in East Anglia and Essex way, but his authority wouldn't really be acknowledged, let's say, somewhere up York, perhaps tacitly, perhaps somewhat at best, and perhaps he'd be a completely different lord up in York, because once
Yeah,
Guthrum,
yeah,
it's quite a bit. It was a bit of a weird picture because, of course, at first the Vikings were all unified, like they're all unified with Centipede, they were going to settle in the land. However, after the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok died, it was kind of like because I think Oswald Spengler said it best, where the Vikings were by nature individualistic, so perhaps there's as much infighting between them as there would be fighting between the Norse and the English at times.
yeah. I mean, they didn't really. It was kind of like they had like this sort of imperium, like this imperial, this like imperial sort of like this tribal confederation, and then it just collapsed. It just collapses. Um, and it's ended up reversed. One thing I will say is, as you mentioned, this in Northumbria, this kingdom here, this Northumbrian kingdom, um, was in fact the puppet of the Danelaw, but then after the battle, I think either they rebelled or it was part of the settlement. I think actually there was like a small rebellion, and then it became like part of the English territory, and it was separate from the Danelaw. The only bit of the Danelaw that was held was really East Anglia and Danish Mercia, as we see here, and also just before someone mentions it, London. London wasn't a major town or city at this point. It really wasn't. It was just a it was more of like a frontier market sort of town at best. It wasn't a major settlement. The major settlements were places like Winchester, um, Lichfield, York, Durham, and Bamborough. That was like the major Anglo-Saxon, uh, towns and cities.
We
Exeter. Sorry, carry on.
AI, we talked last week about the fact that Roman London was pretty much abandoned when the Romans abandoned Britain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I believe. I mean, I think the only time England became, London became somewhat important to the Anglo-Saxons, really as like starting being built up and expanding as a sort of seat of importance. I believe it was Edward the Confessor, really. I that
Well,
that, that
as somebody said in the chat, Alfred took it back from the Danes. But yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, because I believe it was Edward. I think it was Edward the or Athelstan. Because the thing was, London was a middle ground between Wessex and Mercia, so that's why it later became a capital as opposed to Winchester. Because when later on you have Mercia and Northumbria added, and we get a unified kingdom of England, some of the more northern parts they're a bit iffy about having Winchester be the capital. So for reasons of national unity, we ended up moving the capital to London. Now,
And it's also really good to have your capital on a big river in terms of trade and all the rest of it, of course.
yeah,
yeah,
that was that as well. Because there were some trading towns nearby because the Thames River was a big vector for trade in those days. Well, like Windmills Peace in that neck of the woods. But like, yeah, once England really starts to unify, not just under Alfred, but also under his children, Edward the Old and Athelflaed of Mercia, Lady of the Mercians. Yeah, this is where you start to get London becoming the
Yeah,
capital
you can put
for strategic.
AI. You can put any of your pictures on the screen anytime you want at the moment.
okay. I mean, actually, just wanted on a grander scale. This map here shows like how like the full extent of Viking influence, like direct Viking presence in Europe and parts of Asia. Here you go.
Yeah, I was just saying. So if, like, for example, I mean, going to Lincolnshire, for example, for example, back in August, and you see certain towns that always end in B or four, which are which of course are carryover from the North times. It's like, for example, there is there's a town of Merseyside, where I believe it's just by name Kirkby. Kirkby literally means church village in Danish because because it was reckoned that it was either Edward the Elder or his son Athelstan. They settled a lot of converted Danes into that area for reasons of frontier settlement. Because Cumbria at that time wasn't under our overlordship as of yet. And yeah, you'd have to know. And of course, yeah, places like Kirkby or Scunthorpe or Scarborough, other areas. And it's and that's the thing, like English has loads of words from Old Norse. For example, even the word "are," because in Old English we say "you sinned" as opposed to "you are." So some of the most basic words in English come from Old Norse. That's how deeply the Norse settlement has influenced, for example, the English language. Like you also notice some words like egg, husband, ransack, among others, that come from Old Norse. So it's it's reckoned like some people reckon, like with the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the Vikings brought up about women and children. Now I don't know how feasible that could be, given how perilous the North is for men, let alone women and children. I but then on the end, there's also got to be a significant reason why so many Old Norse words are flooded into English. Because it's like, for example, as discussed last week, it's reckoned that Gildas was more correct in saying the Anglo-Saxons wiped out the Celts, because in Old English there's about 30 odd words for the entire English language at that point that come from Welsh. So that's why in the Victorian period, for example, historians generally believed that the Anglo-Saxons wiped out the Celts. Now,
Well,
the fact that
let's be a bit more clear here, Mitch. When the
Another important
Anglo-Saxons,
figure to mention was you had after, well, Alfred the Great's son, Edward the Elder. He, of course, would expand the territories, and also Edward the Elder is well documented by William of Malmesbury. So you can check that out. There was quite a bit by William of Malmesbury on Edward the Elder, and
could we leave
I
Alfred
believe
the Great's AI? Could we please leave?
I'm just trying to think. I think Edward the Elder, he married. Didn't he marry one of the princesses of Mercia?
AI, could we please leave Alfred the Great's son and grandson for a minute?
Go on. Oh,
could we leave Alfred the Great's son and grandson for a minute, because I want to finish on those guys. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
That's all right, mate.
I don't. Sorry, I realized people in chat was saying no. It wasn't me being rude. I don't know what happened.
No, don't worry, man.
I couldn't hear you, but yeah, don't worry. We'll leave that for another time.
It's purely because I want to finish on Alfred the Great's son and grandson, because of course his grandson basically created England, really.
Yeah.
But I want to finish on that. But before we get there, I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about the military side of this stuff, which is quite important, and also I think quite interesting anyway. In terms of things like longships and the armor and weapons and that kind of stuff.
One thing Alfred the Great did was he built up loads of fortresses. A lot of it was based upon old, let's see, I think some of it was based upon old Celtic hill forts, but a lot of it also co-opted Roman ruins. And generally, the whole point of it was that if the Vikings were to raid, the garrison of a particular fort would make sure that all the civilians are safe and that the Vikings couldn't get any plunder.
These are the burrs. I'm sorry, Mitch. These are the burrs, that Alfred created.
Yeah. So you have to. So effectively, it's kind of like similar to those stack houses, I believe they were called in the Great Boer War. Same principle. You cover the land with so many fortresses that the enemy can't basically breathe in your territory when they're coming across a significant.
And these were big enough that the local villagers could take shelter within them if there was a Viking raid.
Yeah. So then there was Alfred the Great bringing in a concept of a navy. Now, a common quote at that time was the wooden wall. Now, this same quote is levied about Athens during the Persian invasion. So, some people reckon the quote from Alfred was BS, which I don't personally believe. I believe something along those lines would have been said regarding what Alfred believed about the navy, because Alfred was of the belief that it wasn't enough to just simply fortify the land. You also had to try and do preventive measures to make sure the Vikings couldn't even so much land a ship, let alone land to begin with, and then start to get troubled by fortresses, and thereby commerce and agriculture and so on get disrupted by Viking incursions. Now, I believe the first few encounters didn't go too well for Anglo-Saxons, but of course, everything has a learning curve to it. After a couple of years of failure and mediocre results, they really do start being successful, and the Vikings started to, instead of raiding England, they start going to other targets like France and Germany and Iberia. So Alfred the Great's military measures in that way were very successful for the Norsemen. in the latter half of his life.
As I've said, there's a plausible claim that it was Alfred the Great who started the Royal Navy. I mean,
Yeah,
most people,
I would imagine so.
most people date it to Elizabeth I or her father, Henry VIII. But there is a plausible claim it actually goes back to Alfred the Great. So, yeah, absolutely. And someone in the chat asked earlier, how many men could you put on a Viking longship? Well, as far as I understand, for the most part, the biggest ones probably only about 150 or maybe a bit more. Not many more than that. They weren't that huge.
Yeah, I was thinking like average longship would be something like, I don't know, let's say 50 men or something. Like I think like the first
Yeah,
longships that raided like Lindisfarne with like 30 men or 20 to 30 men, because the raiding band you had at Lindisfarne wasn't really that big. You'd probably be like, I don't know, 60, 70 men. That's pushing it to say that much. Whereas later on, especially when you have a great heathen army coming in, you need a lot more space on the ships. But the one thing about the Norse was their longships, they couldn't stack loads of provisions. And the other thing was sometimes they had bird feed because the Norse, one way they were able to tell if they were approaching land was launching off a bird. And if a bird came back, then land wasn't ahead. Whereas if a bird didn't come back, then it was a sign that land was impending.
Yeah, and they also knew all sorts of things about clouds, how to navigate using the sun and the moon. I'm not sure how far they went with the stars, but probably some stuff. But even the biggest Viking longships, you wouldn't have had many more than about 150 men on. That would have been a very big ship for those days.
Yeah, it'd be like, you could imagine, let's say Guthrum probably would have a ship like that, but not certainly like an average band of Vikings.
No, they'd have mostly been smaller, Mitch, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But by the way, the Norse, they could navigate the seas via like star maps and or charting the stars. Yeah, they could do that. They were quite well versed in it. And I believe that's how they came to arrive in Iceland and Greenland.
Sure,
in particular.
for sure. And then if you're going to look at like military equipment back then, the most basic weapon was the spear, right?
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't the sword. As I think Mitch mentioned last week, swords were very expensive. Only kings and quite high up chieftains could afford swords. The main weapon of most of the guys was a spear. Axes were quite common, both with the Norse and with the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons also used axes. In terms of armor, if you could afford it, you got yourself a helmet, because that's the first thing anyone buys, because your head's pretty damn vulnerable. So you buy yourself a helmet. If you were relatively wealthy, you had a mail shirt. Yeah, you had a chain mail shirt or harbuk, whatever you want to call it. That was the main sort of armor. And then both the Norse, the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxons used the type of round shield, which is in the picture that AI has shown us. And so that was your protection for the most part. If you were a professional warrior, if you were one of the household troops of either a Anglo-Saxon chieftain or a Norse chieftain, you would have a mail shirt of some description. But most of the other guys would be lucky if they had a helmet.
Yeah, I'm just sharing on the other. I've just brought up
Hang on, mate. I'll add it.
This would be a professional. Now this is a professional Viking. Now this would probably be some noble. As you said, he's got a sword here. He has his axe. probably more of a smaller sword. It's but yeah, he's got his helmet, he's got his chainmail, he's got his his shield here. This would be the oh, excuse me. Let me just go.
Like you think like Huskarls and Thanes and Aldermen kind of
Yeah.
ranks.
Yeah, I
Or you
was
think
just
like-
going to say, guys, by the time of the Battle of Hastings, right, which we will do another stream about in due course, won't be next week, but we will do one. The English housecarls, who were the English kings, the Anglo-Saxon English kings' household troops, often used great big, massive two-handed axes. The Anglo-Saxons used axes just as much as the Danes did.
Yeah.
Just to answer Black Pigeon, I would just say on the use of cavalry, no, the horses in Britain at that time were not suitable for warfare. You could ride a battlefield, but you couldn't use them. Which is what happened with Harold Godwinson, where people often criticise Harold Godwinson for not having cavalry. Well, the horses he had in England at that time were not suitable for warfare.
They were
more
more ponies than horses. Yeah, absolutely. They were more ponies, Mitch, than horses.
I mean, in reality,
so the
Vikings,
the
Vikings were also not famous for their cavalry. So,
I mean, so as this warrior here, this we talk about like the Battle of Edington, for example, like the vast arm that like the made up of the levy troops. This is probably what they would have, had. This would have been them.
Yeah, pretty much. Like I said, if you could afford it, the first bit of armor you got after your sword was a helmet of some description. And that is the most that most of those soldiers on either side would have had.
Having said that, though, I will say, having said that, in the build-up while he was in Somerset, I mentioned that forge at Athelney. There was this great forge. Supposedly he did like mass produce. There was like a large production of over a few months of like chainmail and stuff. So maybe there would have been more like things going around.
Chainmail was very slow to produce, AI, because you had to produce the individual rings, and then you had to join them however many times you wanted to join them to the other bits of chainmail, and that varied. And the more times you joined them, the better the chainmail was, the stronger it was. You couldn't really mass produce it back then. So in like Alfred the Great's time, which is towards the end of the 800s, only the richest and most professional warriors had chainmail, basically.
Yeah,
but
that's
the English equipment and the Norse equipment was pretty much identical. I will show you guys one thing that the English had that was particular to the Anglo-Saxons, and that's these things. Hang on. Where are we?
Oh, well, that's going on.
And this is a sax, and it's partly where I'm not sure if this got its name from the Anglo-Saxons or it helped to give the Anglo-Saxons their name, but it's kind of like a long knife or a short sword. It's pretty similar in some respects to a modern Bowie knife, and you could use this for. Hang on. No, you haven't, AI. You're back.
I'm back.
Yeah. Sorry, it was probably my fault. But you could use a sax as a tool, but you could use it for hunting, and you certainly could also use it for war. And as Mitch explained last week, a sword was a very expensive thing to have in the Dark Ages. But most Anglo-Saxon warriors would have had a sax, something like this. Now, that's a long version, and many of them were shorter. But most Anglo-Saxon warriors, as their backup weapon to a spear, mostly, but occasionally an axe, would have had something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
it
thing
makes,
is the
makes
sax.
sense.
Yeah, the sax. I reckon it was influenced by the Roman gladius because let's say you have a shield wall, right? The front, like, it's a horrible kind of warfare because it takes a long time, generally. But the Anglo-Saxons would often have a sax because you'd stab right, let's say, below the armpit, where it also can pierce along, and that generally can kill a man, like very reliably.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was
And the one I've put up now is a shorter version of the sax, which is more like a knife than a short sword. But nearly every Anglo-Saxon warrior would have carried that as his backup weapon.
I'll just share, Iron Duke. I'll just share a iconography of housecarls who, and you'll see the sax. So these were the, basically professional warrior types, minor nobility types. I mean, here you go. Here's like a, yeah, there you go. So there, you got the sort of version there. There you got the staff and what's supposed to be the sax and everything, and these are this is like some sort of this one is some sort of courtly meeting or something. But yeah, in this one you've got the that is a lot. Yeah, that is a large hat.
But they're helmets. They're plainly metal helmets that these guys are wearing.
Yeah, I can see somebody in chat there with I mean, number one, the sword itself, you have to remember the drawings weren't very best, so but also the
And they were done by monks who were not warriors, but yeah.
they were not warriors. Yeah, I mean, for them, like a short sword is probably quite intimidating sort of thing. The yellow hats, no, they're not. They're not that.
They're plainly meant to be metal helmets, which is, what you would have worn. The first bit of armor you get yourself after a shield is a metal helmet because your head's pretty vulnerable. You've just got to ignore Hollywood movies when no one wears a helmet because they do that in movies so you can recognize who the person is. That's why they never wear a helmet.
The sword is mainly there just to identify that this man, because they're all looking at it.
He's the king.
Well, he's the king. Yeah, he's the king. He's got the staff. He's got the authority.
And as Mitch said last week, swords were enormously expensive. They really were expensive. Like, they'd be the Ferraris of their day.
Yeah, and they got their hands out on like an offering stuff. So, yeah, this is all being like quite a submissive image that they're submitting to the king. But yeah, they're not Jewish. The ones in the hats are not Jewish. And even if
Judeo-Christian was a word or a term that had not been invented in those days. But anyway,
to be honest, there would have been entire Anglo-Saxons who would never have even met a Jewish person. There would have been probably, I mean, not until really in the aftermath of the Norman invasions.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, people are talking about cavalry in the chat. Even in the 100 Years' War, and I recently watched a video which was complete bullshit about the 100 Years' War. But anyway, by a European, by the way, not by an Englishman, I hasten to But even in the 100 Years' War, the English army normally fought on foot. It just became an English thing to do.
Yeah, it's
Now,
one thing.
sorry, just on the Norman cavalry bit, isn't it really that the Norman cavalry was, I guess you could say, made famous because of the Norman conflicts in Sicily and also the First Crusade against the Seljuk
Yep.
Turks?
Yeah.
That was where their cavalry was really shown off. Because again, the Turks were known as the best horse up until that point, the best horsemen in the world.
Look, the Norman cavalry, if you want to put it this way, won the Battle of, and I say it, we'll do a stream on this later on in the year, but the Norman cavalry won the Battle of Hastings, not because they were able to overcome the English infantry, because they were not, but because by feigning a retreat, they made some of the less disciplined English infantry chase them and break their formation. Had they not done so, the Norman cavalry weren't going to win that battle, frankly. So yeah, all right, they won, but they won by a trick, and because some of the English militia were not very well trained. Like the housecarls, the professional English infantry, would never have bloody well chased them, you know.
Yeah, it probably was a real shit show on the battlefield. I can imagine you had housecarls and trying to shout and get in the way to stop them from charging down, and
and they couldn't, because the housecarls were mostly in the middle of the English formation. It was the freed on the flanks. It was the freed on the flanks who chased after the Normans, lost their formation, and then got killed.
Yeah, it was Mark Morris he got a book on the Norman conquest, and he was saying that the housecarls, a couple of them did try to go down the hill to stop, but it was just too late.
Yeah,
it was. I think even Godwinson went down himself to try and. I mean, he was like, he got into the fray of it because he was like, well, I'm going to have to try and rectify this, and he couldn't. He just couldn't.
Yeah, it was like, if you're infantry fighting cavalry, you can beat them. You certainly can, but you have to stay in formation. You can't be a loose collection of dudes, because then the cavalry will ride you down. So you can't do that. All right, guys, I'm sorry. This was a little bit of a going off to one side, because I did just want to talk a little bit about the military side of things, and the fact that the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse, the Vikings, had pretty much the same equipment, to be honest. But I thought, to finish, we would talk, as AI had started to earlier, about Alfred the Great's son and grandson, because his grandson in particular basically created England, really.
Yeah.
He fulfilled Alfred the Great's dream of creating a united English kingdom. Go for it, guys.
I'll just say, so just two things, because you're older to be older, but you're his sister Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. Now, Athelflaed, contrary to what the last kingdom showed, she did not go anywhere near a battlefield. She would have been a figurehead inspiring resistance, like Joan of Arc, but she would not be actually anywhere near the front lines as a woman.
No one would have even risked her if she'd have wanted to be. They would have just said, not a chance, you know. But
second point,
she was this figurehead.
And the second point was, so the Stafford knot. It's reckoned to come up a time when Athelflaed was visiting Stafford to review, I think, the garrison or something, or one of the burghs there. A small Viking army besieged her in Stafford. So she got a message out to surrounding boroughs to send troops to help her. This is where so Lichfield and Tamworth were the main ones in the area that helped her. After the Viking army was beaten off, it was said that Aethelflaed bound the hands of the garrison commanders of Stafford, Tamworth, and Lichfield, and this is where the county of Staffordshire has its origins. That's at least a local folklore story from this time.
And of course, that used to be the regimental badge of the Staffordshire Regiment. So yeah, the Staffordshire knot.
Some people are saying so I put Obnis stuff Ule Laffe. Obnis stuff Ule Raffe, which that's how you would say hold your wrath. This is what Harold Godwinson would have shouted to his spearmen as they were chasing the Normans down the hill. That weird looking but weird looking letter at the end, between like that basically is like a f sound. So that's for anyone who's not understanding that weird letter at the end of the first word. It just pronounces. It's just you say it as a f, like at the end of wrath, or yeah.
Before AI or Mitch carry on, I would just say, guys, if you've got questions you really want answered, if you use the entropy link at the top of the stream, you can send us an entropy super chat, and we will answer any of those questions at the end of the stream if they're that important to you. But anyway, guys, carry on. About Alfred's son and grandchildren, please.
Yeah, so when Athelstan, Alfred's son, Alfred's grandson, because Alfred's son was Edward the Elder, he would expand in Mercia, and then you would have Athelstan, who would then go on to conquer into Northumbria, and upon his death, effectively, England, the English. I believe when Edward died in 924, his realm of England was basically everything south of the Humber. I think there was, what was it? The Viking king Sitrick ruled the kingdom of basically York, still ruled at York, and you had sort of Yorkshire was sort of still split. You had sort of like this bizarre return to Bernicia and Deria sort of situation where it was sort of split again, but this would, I believe, under Edward the Elder, that this would eventually come back under Anglo-Saxon control. But you did have in this time of going even up until 1066, you had this Northumbria particularly was very, very distant and politically remote from the rest of the goings on the kingdom and the kings down in Wessex, and they were basically as near as independent as you could get.
Yeah, I was going to say, so one thing to bear in mind is that the name Sitrick is actually an Anglo-Saxon name. So by this point of the Danelaw, there's significant intermixing between the Viking settlers and the original English. One quote I often see on Reddit, and this is often quoted a lot because everyone loves to crap on the English, was apparently English women preferred Nordic men because apparently Nordic men were seen as more hygienic, which no, like the hygiene standards of the Vikings were not that different from the hygiene standards of the English. So I just like this is often like a Reddit myth that permeates around this time about the Danelaw that English women cuckolded Englishmen by going for Viking men, and so well, they went for Viking men because there wasn't really much difference between a Viking man and an Englishman. Perhaps it's a matter of Viking men were more the elite, but it wasn't because of some Reddit tier hygiene posting, as I often see. So I just want to nip that myth in the bud.
Yeah, that was bullshit, Mitch. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic people, and their hygiene standards would have been pretty damn similar, to be honest.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, I
often like
mean,
an anti-Christian kind of sentiment. They always I've seen some pagans say that Christianity made Anglo-Saxons dirtier compared to the cleaner Norse
Yeah,
pagans.
I mean
I know.
that doesn't make any sense though. That does the
No,
hygiene stuff
it's
because in
false.
Christianity hygiene is that's why you have like the same cleanliness as next to godliness, that sort of stuff. I mean there was like hygiene, there was fragrances. You did have washing. People would wash.
Yeah, they
You
used
would
to change their clothes. They didn't all look like Dark Age bikers or anything like that either.
I mean,
People liked quite brightly dyed clothes and things back in those days. They weren't not everyone wore black or grey or brown. It's modern bullshit, basically.
Yeah, I mean there was an image up. I remember on Facebook there was like, this is what Hollywood shows as like an Anglo-Saxon and a Viking people, and the Anglo-Saxons are all wearing like brown and like dirty, and they're covered in mud, and they have like this mudded coughs, and they looked absolutely filthy and disgusting. And then you have like the Norse wearing like the leather biker outfits and like these wacky like mohawk hairstyles and things like that.
Yeah,
And then you got like this is what they really looked like, and you have like Anglo-Saxon wearing like a green or blue tunic with a cape, and then maybe like some red shorts and
Yes.
trousers and
Yes.
some leather strapping shoes. And then you have like, oh, what are the Vikings wearing? Oh, they're wearing like a green tunic with a cape. And the thing though is, if you were to go back in time and see maybe like York, walk around York at that time and see and say, oh, spot the Anglo-Saxon and spot the sort of Norse, unless you spoke to them or you got up close, maybe to look at certain patterns or certain
or
styles,
how rich they were, or how rich and powerful they were. Yeah,
you probably wouldn't be able to tell just by looking immediately. You'd be like, okay, everyone's wearing these pretty like decent colored clothing, these different various colors. Yeah, you couldn't really tell. And one thing I would say,
have a look at the thumbnail for this stream. That is an Anglo-Saxon shield wall, pretty realistically dressed, from about the late 800s, and they're not wearing black, grey, or brown. They're wearing nice clothes, and they're wearing armor, and that was how people dressed. I'm sorry, it was.
I will say that I just typed in on Google. Okay, so probably this was my first mistake. Viking, like accurate Viking clothing, and guess what it comes up with? The biker leather.
Oh God!
Actually, this is a good example. I've got one up here. Like this is just like your basic Viking, just Norse clothing. I was bringing it up here.
Hang on a minute, I'll put it on.
Yeah.
There you go.
It pretty like that's probably it. That's probably what a Viking give him a spear, that would have been like one of the members of the great, and a shield. That's like your average warrior on the great heathen army. There you go.
Yeah, but it would have also been the average warrior in the English army, in the Anglo-Saxon army.
Yeah.
If
you look a bit closer, he's got a sort of Thor's hammer medallion, but also the
Okay,
pattern.
well, so the
It's-
English guys
yeah.
might have worn a cross instead. That would have again been the difference.
Yeah. Basically, that's the difference.
Someone in the chat said the red coat thing always confuses me because it's like anti-camouflage. I gotta tell you, Dominus Diabolus, that this was tested by some friends of mine in South Africa, and at say 800 yards, you can't really see the red coat any more than you can see any other coat. The only thing you notice is the white crossbelts. And British Army redcoats, which were brick red, mostly not scarlet, only officers wore scarlet, are they used to fade in the sunlight and the rain and all the rest of it. And they were probably no easier to see than a blue coat or any other color of cloak.
But also, like, bear in mind, these armies would travel in like blocks and groups, so it wouldn't really. I mean, it's not like, they're not going to be like.
No. You'd be saying, "Oh, look, there's 500 men. I can see them because some of them have got red coats on." Yeah, it's just nonsense. It was 500 men. It was a blob of humans.
Yeah, they if it's like, when Alfred arrived at Eddington, he knew Guthrum's army would be coming because they had scouts. It's the same reason Hastings, where Hastings happened to it where it did, because you had scouts going back and forth between both armies saying, "Oh, we move here. They're heading this way. They're heading this direction. Oh, this is where we're going to meet. Oh, we're meeting it on Hastings." So there was like, because one thing that is not really shown in battles and films is actually the slow arrival of troops. Particularly at that time, they would sort of drip in slowly.
And you have to form them up. You have to form these guys into shield walls and ranks, because contrary to Vikings and Hollywood and every other bullshit thing that modern people see, people don't fight like it's a riot. They don't. They stay in formation with your friends on both sides of you.
The worst thing I've seen in The Last Kingdom, actually depicting the Battle of Eddington, believe it or not, is the main character. What was his name? The Uhtred the Heathen. Uhtred the Heathen, or what it was. He jumps a Viking shield wall, does like a somersault,
and then would have got killed. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then jumps behind and then just slaughters like a whole rank of shield wall. And it's like, okay, in reality, he would have somersaulted. Well, first of all, they would have all laughed at him. First of all, the Vikings would have laughed at him as being a madman, just like lost his mind completely.
Yeah,
and then just speared him to death.
They would have speared him in the second.
Speared him to death. Yeah, basically.
He wouldn't have lasted a second. Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth noting. So in that Vikings series, one thing they do portray correctly was so you have Floki, right? He's a skinny fella. He often stays behind and he kills anyone who peeps in through, who manages to break through the shield wall, because of course they'll be confused and whatnot. If Uhtred were to do that, someone would be lurking behind the main rank of the shield wall and just like kill him. Either for
but also the shield wall is going to be 3 or 4 ranks deep, and the guys at the back of it would have just speared him, basically.
Vikings was pretty bad. Last Kingdom, first few seasons of war, right? But there can be issues, and this is just a problem with TV.
One thing I struggle with The Last Kingdom, and this is something I really struggle with, guys. I mean, Vikings is very inaccurate, but one thing I struggle with The Last Kingdom is, in the first season, the Anglo-Saxons, like the way that they're depicted, the armor and everything, clothing, is accurate. But then for the Vikings, they go for bootleg, like a biker gear.
Apart from the shields.
Well, apart from the shields, yeah.
Yeah,
Apart
the
from the shields.
shields should be round, the same as the Vikings ones.
Same as the
'cause-
Vikings.
Yeah.
But it's like the art department was like run by a schizophrenic.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
No. I think you're entirely correct. Look, guys, we will do a part 3 of this stream. It won't be next week because I know what we're doing next week, but it'll be sometime this year, and that will be about probably the end of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom and the Battle of Hastings and William the Bastard's invasion and all this kind of stuff. All right, so we will do that, but I'll work out with you two gents when you want to do it. But next week's Splendid Isolation History stream is going to be about the Anglo-German naval race from between about 1890 and 1914, and why, in fact, the Germans never could win it and didn't stand an earthly of doing so either. But anyway, that's going to be next week's one. I have a stream later on today, which is going to be my Anzac Day stream for this year, although Anzac Day is officially tomorrow, my time, because I'm on Thursday already. But later on today, I'm going to be doing an Anzac Day stream. I do one every year because I'm an Englishman who lives in Australia, and I think I should. And I'm going to have some interesting guests. I'm going to have someone from the British Australian Society, and also someone from the Australian Patriotic League, which may have even changed its name now. But anyway, I'll have those guys, and I'm going to try and get Tim Wilms if he wants to come on.
Isn't there an Australian Monarchist League? Is that the same people?
I have no idea, to be honest with you. I'm not even sure if these guys haven't changed their name a bit, but they're in favour of Australia being the traditional place that it always has been, like an Anglo-Celtic country.
I mean, Australia is it's an English island. It's an English or continent.
I'd say Anglo-Celtic, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's Australians are British. I mean, that's just at its core.
Yeah, but most Australians are British even today, but you know, by descent. But yeah, okay. But anyway, I've got a stream on that coming up in about 11 hours, roughly. A bit less, actually. So in about 11 hours, if you want to watch that, you can come on, and that'll be good. We will be back on Saturday with our normal Me Too, Dominus Diabolus. My mother was born in the Republic of Ireland, but if someone asked me, I'm an Englishman because I am. So there we go. But anyway, yeah, and we will have a stream at this time on Saturday, which is our normal political current events and news stream. Come and join us for that one. Anything you would like to plug, Mitch?
Nah, not for me. I imagine I imagine part 3 will be like when we continue this. I imagine the first one will be talking about a Brew number.
For sure, man. Yep.
But that's imagine I got to watch that film one of these days. That Last Kingdom, Seven Kings must die.
It's actually not bad. It's the like as you said, Mitch, that show, The Last Kingdom, after the first 3 seasons went totally feminist and all sorts of bullshit. But the last thing they did, which was that movie, Seven Kings Must Die, wasn't that terrible. And they even make an attempt to show a realistic battle, which is way better than most of the Hollywood battles you ever see. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it's accurate, but they at least tried to make it accurate.
Yeah, I suppose like the main issue I had with that film was Uhtred just never ages. Like he's still. I mean, you factor he's meant to be like what? He's got to be like
Yeah.
70s or 80s by that point, but for some reason he looks like
Yeah,
in his
mate,
30s.
I wouldn't have chosen that actor to play Uhtred anyway. But I mean, there you go. They wanted a pretty boy, so they got a pretty boy. So
Yeah.
AI. Anything you would like to plug, mate, like your channel, etc.
Yeah, got my channel, AI Homelander. I mean, apart from that, just just to tell people as well, but particularly those in Britain, that we sort of have to be faithful to who we are. We talk about people like Alfred the Great, and the the people of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which are our ancestors. They are our ancestors. They're not not an abstract group. They're not. They are our part of us. They lived in the very same villages and towns as us.
Yep.
And there's been a few things that have happened this week, and people are a bit demoralized, and of a few events. But I think, to be honest, the only win that we can have as English people is that we embrace those people in the past, and basically sort of rediscover that sort of group self-consciousness, and not be ashamed of it. Just not be ashamed of it anymore, and not allowing others to shame us. And to be honest, I think I'm of the total view now where if somebody even attempts to shame our group, you just push back on them. You just push back.
100%.
You attack them and you push them back,
Yeah,
because at
100%.
the end of the day, yeah, I I have no time for them. And so that's my final point on this. And to be honest, no matter what happens, like people getting disappointed or something, the one thing that will is effectively being true to us and being true to our own group and our own sense of identity, and that is the most important thing of all. And I think the more we do these history streams where we're talking about, we talk about the 19th century and the height of the British Empire, which is a bit more closer to us. It's a bit more closer to us than this. But we're talking. I mean, throughout tonight, we've talked
They're
about.
still our ancestors, AI. These
Well,
people we've been talking about are still our ancestors.
yeah, I
And you can totally be proud of them because they never buckled. They never surrendered. They fought and they fought until they won.
Yeah, and I mean, not to, the depictions of the orcs, as this ultimate force of evil
Yep.
in Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. For many Anglo-Saxon peasants, people, the sort of gentry, they would have, these men on the battlefield in their minds, whether it wasn't true, but in their minds they would have known their adversaries were like them, but they were pagan and they were heathens, and so for them they would have been outside that moral framework, and it would have been a very daunting aspect. Of course, they would have been all of them would have been there would have been fear, because there's always fear. There's only a madman would go onto a battlefield without fear in them.
Well,
Um, I
the English warriors, the Anglo-Saxon warriors, still defeated the Norse, who were the most fearsome warriors in the known world at that time, and they still defeated them.
Exactly, because the Norse, remember that for them to die in battle was a huge honor, because the Valkyries
They'd go
would
to
carry you up.
Valhalla, yeah.
Yeah, carry up to Valhalla. So I mean, the type of warrior you're facing, is on itself, has a very different relationship to death. These men were incredible. Our ancestors they were incredible. This is an incredible feat. It's not something that can be played down, and anyone who does attempt to play it down, is just a straight up scumbag in my view.
I always remember AI that the English, when they were fighting the Norse invaders, the Danes, the Vikings, whatever you want to call them, their cry when they were in battle was out, 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 because they were going to kill them.
Yeah. Yeah, and the best bit was, people say, Guthrum, like, why did he convert and why did he remain sort of committed to his word? One of the sources does actually suggest that he, in that moment, he realized that, the Christian God was on Alfred's side. I mean, this is from the Alfred and the Christian monk perspective, but there was that bit where they broke the Viking shield wall, and they were in full retreat, and they were chasing them down.
Yep.
These common gentry with their spears, and they were chasing down the great heathen army, farmers
Well,
and
the
craftsmen.
the next episode we do of this, and let's be fair, the English had their own warriors too. I mean, the English had their household troops, but the next episode of this that we do, we'll talk about the Harold, the King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king, and his great victory against another Danish invading army at Stamford Bridge.
Yeah, I mean that is considered
Yeah,
the last of the Vikings. I mean Harold Hardrada is, I think he
yeah.
is considered by historians the last of the Vikings. And I mean, I would say the Viking age ended a bit before him, but because he
Well,
was a raider.
he said to Alfred, "How much English land are you going to give me?" And
Yeah,
Harold turned around and said, "About 7 feet
of
for your
English soil.
grave, for
Yeah,
your
for a grave.
grave."
For your grave. Yeah. Yeah, he basically just he said it straight. This is the thing. He said it straight to his face. They
Mm.
had like a translate. Tolstik was there translating. He just looked at him and just said and spat. He spat at him and then walked off. Harold was known for the brutality on the Welsh marches. Harold Godwinson wasn't. I mean, I know some people like to present him as like some sort of Machiavellian. He was in the ear of Edward the Confessor and managed to worm his way. He was a
I think,
tough son. He was a tough bugger. Harold Godwinson was
yeah,
a
he
tough
was a brave and
guy.
a brave king too, who led his men in
He
battle.
was a brave king. And no, Godwinson wasn't a Viking. Harold Hardrada, or Howard Sigurdsson, as his proper name is, was the Harold, Norwegian Harold. Harold Godwinson was the Duke. Was he the Earl of Wessex? I
Yeah,
think he was the Earl of Wessex.
he was the Earl of Wessex. Yeah,
He was the Earl of Wessex. Morcar was the Earl of Northumbria. And I think Edgar was the was it Mercia? Something like that.
yeah. Anyway, guys, we've been going for 2.5 hours. AI, thank you very much for joining me. You know way more about this stuff than I do. And similarly to Mitch, who's had to leave us. Mitch, thank you very much for joining us. Mitch and AI know a lot more about this era of history than I do. And I wouldn't have been able to do this stream without them. Do go and check
But
out.
the same spirit that we would talk about today was exactly the same people that defeated the Zulus at Rorke's Drift,
Yep.
that fought, in at Kohima against
Yep.
the Japanese forces. That same mindset is perennial. It is within the English people, within the British
That's
people. But
England and that's Britain. Yeah, I totally
yeah,
agree with you.
and
AI.
that's why Saint George is the patron saint of England, because it is a warrior saint for a warrior people, and that
Yeah,
is it.
he was fighting. He was fighting against this evil monster dragon, which no other person could defeat. You know.
No, exactly.
This is the point. This evil monster dragon had beaten every other soldier who attacked him. So yeah, I think he's an appropriate patron saint for England, because Englishmen are good, brave, and we don't boast too much. But yeah, I'm very fond of the English people. Kind of love them. Anyway, guys, we will see you on Saturday. Sorry, I'll see you later on today for an Anzac Day stream.
I'll see you like in 11 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, this is going to be a stream about the British people who sailed in Australia and some of the wonders those guys did. It'll be good. So come and join us for that, and we'll check you later, boys. I'm going to play us out of a tune, which, as it's St. George's Day, I hope will be appropriate.
Now I am St. George, I'm a champion bold, and over old England my flag I'll unfold. My sword fights for justice with truth for my shield, and when I come riding I never shall yield. Now I am St. George, I'm a champion bold, and over old England my flag I'll unfold. My sword fights for justice with truth for my shield, and when I come riding I never shall yield. And on my breast a red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. I fought with the dragon and brought it to shame. I was killed 7 but I still fought again. I was killed 7 times, but it did me no ill. If the battle be true, then I'll fight again still. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she grows. In the cause of all freedom my banner shall wave. The oppressed and downtrodden my sword it shall save. In the righting of wrongs I never shall tire. That the weak become strong is all my desire. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. I'll watch o'er your still your friend I will stand. I'll strengthen your courage for all you hold dear, to vanquish all doubt and banish all fear. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. Now be sure in your heart, if you call on my name, for I fight with the fury of fire and flame. Any lies or deceit, to a cinder I'll burn, and once you invoke me, I never shall turn. And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes. For I have the power to pierce to the heart. I strike like the lightning, I can tear you apart. On hoofbeats of thunder over England I'll ride. What foe can defy you with me by your side? And on my breast a red, red rose, the flower of old England wherever she goes.
And that was from Patriotic Archive. Do go and check out his excellent YouTube channel. Thank you very much to my guests, Mitch and AI. Very kind of you for your gentlemen to join me. And happy St. George's Day to all good Englishmen in the world.
Goodbye.